The Amistad case is a court case buried deep in American and world history and is often forgotten as a major event concerning the views on slavery and the international slave trade. Though a seemingly small event during high times of slavery, the Amistad case not only dealt with one of the few successful slave revolts, but marked a time in history where slaves became more than property. So, what was the Amistad case? To understand the details of the case, we need to understand what actually occurred. During February of 1839, Portuguese slave hunters took a group of Africans from their homeland of Sierra Leone to Havana, Cuba. From Havana, Pedro Montes and Jose Ruiz, who were plantation owners, selected 53 slaves to take with them on the Amistad, a Spanish-built ship, which translates to friendship, but that's a little bit ironic in this case, because this wasn't a very friendly encounter. On June 28th, the Amistad left Havana to sail towards Caribbean plantations. The slaves, however, had a different idea, and on June 1st, 4 nights after being taken on the ship, the slaves were led by Joseph Cinque, who was also known as Sangbe Pie, to revolt against the plantation owners. Fighting out of their shackles after overhearing threats from the crew to possibly eat them, the slaves managed to kill everyone on the ship except the 2 plantation owners. Enraged, the Africans ordered Montes and Ruiz to take them back to Sierra Leone. The plantation owners would steer the ship towards Africa during the day, but would switch courses during the night, resulting in the ship traveling north towards Connecticut over a 6-week period. On August 24th, 1839, a U.S. brig called Washington seized the ship at sea and brought it ashore. The slaves had been illegally taken from Sierra Leone since the slaves had actually killed members on the ship. They were imprisoned and charged with murder and other charges, while the plantation owners walked away without any issues. This controversy led to both abolitionists and the ex-president John Quincy Adams fighting for the slaves' freedom, which ultimately impacted views on the slave trade and slavery. Following the slaves' capture, abolitionists were angered by the unfair treatment of the slaves and raised money in order to support them. Action by abolitionists shone a spotlight on the case, drawing it into the attention of the courts. 3 days after the ship had been seized from sea, a criminal trial heard by the Circuit Court with Judge Smith Thompson concerning charges of murder, mutiny, and piracy was held. The trial resulted in Thompson declaring that the court didn't have the power to decide the charges since the alleged crimes were not committed on U.S. territory. They were at sea in Spanish waters, and so they couldn't be punished under U.S. laws. Though the slaves weren't succumbed to their crimes, this didn't really help solve the problem since the court didn't know whether the slaves were actual Spanish property or not, which led to a second trial in the district court. The second trial in district court was held in November 1839, which was a civil trial, which was heard by Judge Andrew Judson. Interestingly, the trial occurred for 2 days and then was postponed to January. However, during the testimony, the Africans' lawyers worked to help prove that the Africans were not Spanish and were ultimately illegally taken as slaves. And since the international slave trade was illegal and the Africans weren't participating in the domestic slave trade since they weren't Spanish, that the actions of the plantation owners was illegal. This is a key aspect of the case since the Africans couldn't actually speak English and advocate for themselves, allowing the plantation owners to manipulate the names to create Spanish ones to deceive the court. However, this was also an advantage in the sense that since the slaves couldn't actually speak Spanish, this raised questions about the identity of them as Spanish, suggesting that they had been illegally taken from somewhere else. Moving from these details, in the second trial, Judson eventually sided with the Africans, declaring them as free men illegally abducted from their homeland, and that they should be returned to Africa. This wasn't the end, however. Circuit Court Judge Thompson appealed Judson's decision, sending the case to the Supreme Court. Once the case landed in Supreme Court, the lawyers turned to John Quincy Adams, the ex-president of the United States, to make a statement. Adams not only provided a compelling argument to convince the justices of the Supreme Court in favor of the slaves, but even went so far as to quote the Declaration of Independence when he said, "The moment you come to the Declaration of Independence, that every man has a right to life and liberty, an inalienable right, this case is decided. I ask nothing more in behalf of these unfortunate men than this declaration." Following Adams' moving speech, the Supreme Court ruled that the actions of the Africans on the ship to lash out against the ship crew was justifiable, since it is the right of humans to resist opposition and injustice in any manner they see fit. The Africans were kidnapped and suffered immensely on the ship, and their treatment on the ship would therefore justify their desire to take it over for their own good, and the court saw that the slaves shouldn't be tied to the murder charges, since without being illegally abducted, this event wouldn't have occurred in the first place. This case was ultimately considered a step in the direction towards challenging slavery and the idea of people as property, as the Africans won the case. Now that we've gone over the basics of what the case actually was, this this portion that we talked about only really deals with the slaves. As previously mentioned, a U.S. brig had salvaged the Amistad from sea, and there was a whole other argument surrounding the proceeds that should go to the people on the U.S. Washington brig. So this concept is something called maritime laws, which are laws concerning ships and other vessels at sea. The law in play here is a law about salvage, which is that people are allowed to get compensation when they save a ship and or its cargo from impending loss. In this case, Lieutenant Thomas R. Jedney, the person who led the U.S. Washington brig in saving the Amistad, argued that since he saved the ship and used a lot of effort and many resources to do so, he had a reason to get compensation and also have rights to the slaves. The value of the cargo and slaves totaled to around $65,000, $40,000 for the cargo and $25,000 for the slaves. However, in response, since the Africans were actually free, Jedney didn't have any rights to the slaves, which was argued by representatives of the Africans. Though a smaller detail in the case, this thought of the idea of property sparked further discussion about the implications of defining people as property and the consequences that would foster. Another interesting detail in this case is the controversy surrounding President Van Buren during the trial period. Van Buren was against setting the slaves free because his family actually had owned slaves and he didn't want to lose Southern voting support. Even before the Supreme Court case, Van Buren wanted to take the slaves back to Cuba before the second trial in district court could actually come to a decision, so the slaves couldn't win the case. And Van Buren had also tried to misinterpret Spanish documents about the legality of slave importation to Cuba, to sway the court in the direction of the plantation owners and Spanish government. Despite his mischievous ways, the slaves ended up winning the case, demonstrating how the idea of the free man written in the Declaration of Independence played a central role in drawing the boundary between slaves as property rather than people, which is a key focus of this case. Since the Amistad case is often left out of the conversation of slavery, why is this event even important? Well, the case is important in two aspects. One, the Amistad case helped solidify the abolitionist movement, which at the time was a fractured and very unpopular group. And two, it was one of the few successful slave revolts. Speaking on the first point, finding an event to center their energy and movement around helped define the abolitionist group and helped determine what they were fighting for, which was ultimately the injustices of slavery. This led to the Amistad Committee, which was formed by 3 abolitionists which still exists today and has continued to advocate for equal rights through research, workshops, and publications. In addition, the case was also depicted through various art forms such as portraits, prints, photographs, and other forms of media to depict the magnitude of the problem and call the public to consider this as a major event in world and American history regarding the issues of slavery and slave trade. To the second point I made, the Amistad Revolt was one of the few only successful slave revolts, and following this incident, many abolitionists saw the win in court as the first step after the abolishment of the international slave trade in the United States in 1808 to eventually abolish slavery in the United States. So, thank you for listening to this podcast about the Amistad case and revolt, and bibliography is at the end of this podcast.